I think it's time to catch up with an old friend.
Oh, I like the sound of that.
Do you want me to give you some clues about who I've arranged for us to have a reunion with?
Yes.
Yeah.
Journalistic legend.
Okay.
Has worked in many mediums, whether
Okay.
television or newspapers.
Okay.
Sometimes there's quite a lot of tweets saying people wish we would get out of the way and let him come back to this.
Oh, I know who that is.
It's Andrew Neil.
Hooray.
Hello, Andrew.
Hello to you. Nice to hear from you.
We have called you up and tapped you up because we want to get all your thoughts about the Franco-British relationship on this special day when everyone's been thinking about Charles de Gaulle.
Well, I'm glad you have, because the Franco-British relationship is actually in pretty good condition at the moment, which may surprise you. Brexit, you think, might have derailed it. But curiously, what it's actually meant, and I can come on and talk a bit more about this, is that Brexit has put more of a premium on the bilateral relationship between London and Paris than before. And I expect we're going to see it develop a lot more in the months ahead, regardless of how the Brexit negotiations go.
And much more from our new South of France correspondent very shortly.
On this episode of the Coronavirus Newscast.
The Coronavirus Newscast from the BBC.
Hello, it's Adam in the studio.
And it's Laura in the studio, but I'm going to say bonsoir instead.
Bonsoir, Laura, from Christophe in Le Box of News.
And you took it that bit further.
We'll talk about Charles de Gaulle's famous speech. It was the 80th anniversary of it today. And we thought we'd mark it by getting a living famous French legend to recreate it in their living room. And we got David Ginola.
No.
Fantastic.
Alors.
Honor, common sense, and the interests of the country require that all free Frenchmen, wherever they be, should continue the fight as best they may.
Stirring stuff from David Ginola. Also, not sure if you're aware, it's also the 3rd anniversary of the first ever episode of a podcast called Brexitcast.
I didn't know that. Joyeux anniversaire.
And that is why the Élysée Palace sent the president to London today.
Did he not pop in and see you, Chris?
He didn't have time, apparently.
Oh, okay.
Never mind.
Anyway, right, on with today's news. And so Dominic Raab, the Foreign Secretary, has made some controversial comments on the radio this morning when he was asked about this symbol that people have been doing of taking the knee, whether it's American footballers doing it a few years ago or British footballers doing it in the last couple of days in solidarity with Black Lives Matters campaigners. Here's what Dominic Raab said when he was asked about it this morning.
I understand this sense of frustration and restlessness which is driving the Black Lives Matters movement. I've got to say on this taking the knee thing, which I don't know, maybe it's got a broader history, but seems to be taken from the Game of Thrones, feels to me like a symbol of subjugation and subordination rather than one of liberation and emancipation. But I understand people feel differently about it, so it's a matter of personal choice.
So would you or wouldn't you do it?
Take the knee for two people, the Queen and the Missus, when I asked her to marry me.
That was Julia Hartley-Brewer interviewing the Foreign Secretary on Talk Radio this morning. Laura, subjugation, Game of Thrones.
I think it's fair to say that was not the most diplomatic choice of words from the politician who is, after all, our diplomat-in-chief. And for several reasons is, number one, this is an enormously emotive and sensitive subject. And I think all politicians normally try to carefully be as sensitive as they possibly can, and kind of having a bit of a laugh was obviously not going to go down very well with lots of people. The second thing is that taking the knee is something that actually has been talked about not just in the last couple of weeks, but a couple of years ago. There was a huge storm in the US. President Trump was furious with American football players for doing that as a protest about discrimination in the US. But also, if you go back even further, you know, this is also a sort of modern echo of how Martin Luther King sometimes prayed at protests or during court trials. And even further back, there was abolitionism in the 19th century. There was a very famous image of a slave on their knees that was sort of a symbol of that fight at the time. So to sort of say, oh, there might be a bit of wider history here, but maybe it's something about Game of Thrones, was obviously seen by pretty disrespectful by a lot of people right at this moment. Yeah.
And the criticism came pretty quick, didn't it, from David Lammy, the Shadow Justice Secretary, from Lisa Nandy, the opposition number, Oppo, if you like, for the Foreign Secretary, Shadow Foreign Secretary, Ed Davey for the Lib Dems. And I suppose, as you say, that diplomat-in-chief role, Laura, that there was the Foreign Secretary giving a whole round of interviews, the morning round, as we call it, popping up on numerous TV and radio outlets all morning, gets to the last one before he goes off to meet his French opposite number, and says something that isn't very diplomatic and becomes the news story.
And I think, unfortunately, the government keeps saying repeatedly, we understand people's frustration, they're going to have another review. But there have been a few little moments where people who suspect that actually they don't really get it in government, they don't really understand people's frustration or the depths of it, or the depths of the anxiety. This adds to the impression that some people have that actually the government doesn't really get how strong feelings are. And missteps like this, whether it's that interview this morning or Matt Hancock mixing up the name of Marcus Rashford earlier this week, it just gives that sense to people who are concerned and angry and frustrated that the government's maybe not as on top of all of this as they'd like to be.
And the Foreign Secretary obviously realised quite quickly that he had to come out and clarify his comments. And a couple of hours after the interview, he sent a tweet saying, to be clear, I have full respect for the Black Lives Matter movement and the issues driving them. If people wish to take a knee, that's their choice and I respect it. We all need to come together to tackle discrimination and social injustice.
The clarificatory tweet.
And then he was visiting the BBC to mark the anniversary of the famous Charles de Gaulle broadcast. And he was asked about it, but didn't really say anything about it, although the story did chase him there.
Yes, it did.
Now, in the next in our series of government ministers saying things that make you go, Matt Hancock, the Health Secretary, said this at the Downing Street briefing.
I would not recommend an app unless I'm confident in it. I've explained, I hope, why the best parts of the two systems that we've been working on can be brought together. But I am confident that we will get there. We will put that cherry on Dido's cake.
He kind of hesitated a bit, didn't he? Was it one of those moments? Because I'm conscious that given the line of work that we're in, you shouldn't throw too many stones in glass houses, because we may have been in a similar boat occasionally ourselves when you get halfway down a sentence in front of a camera and realise that reversing is really not an option.
No. So, Chris, can you explain why that slightly perplexing statement came out of the Health Secretary's mouth?
Oh, I thought you wanted me to... Oh, right, yeah. No, I'll do the political bit. I thought you wanted me to talk about why that phrase was unfortunate.
Gaffes you've narrowly avoided.
Oh, no. I mean, our programme's not on long enough for that. It really isn't. So this is all about the app, isn't it? I mean, I think we said a couple of weeks ago it's not happening, and we said a week ago it's still not happening. And what have we heard in the last couple of days? Well, this app is not coming anytime soon at all. One of Matt Hancock's junior ministers said yesterday that it could be the winter. Matt Hancock today wouldn't go anywhere near putting a time frame on it, which is kind of proof that it is nowhere near happening. And basically, the app that the NHS had been trialling on the Isle of Wight, this centralised app, as opposed to one that is decentralised, that's important in terms of where the data sits in the whole process, doesn't work. It isn't compatible with various systems. And so they're going to rely on the old-fashioned stuff, the testing and tracing stuff of emailing and phoning up people and getting emails and phone calls out to people you may have bumped into. But it does mean that if you're sat next to somebody on the bus who has coronavirus, you're not going to be told about it, because there's going to be no way that they can get in touch with you.
And it's all got into a tangle with the technology companies too. But essentially what's happened is the NHS is giving up on developing its own app and is instead going to be working with the tech companies. But there is a bit of intrigue. There was a bit of reporting in the Times this morning, and I've heard a few whispers about it this afternoon, about how the tech companies may have been being rather, shall we say, less than helpful, and perhaps not just with the UK government, but perhaps also other governments around the world. But why this matters is because this was meant to be a central part of how the government wants to get out of this and into the second phase, where we can all kind of manage our lives while trying to manage the disease as a country. And it ain't happening, cherry or no cherry.
And Dido, of course, is Dido Harding, who's running the Test and Trace programme. She's a Conservative peer.
Yes.
Right, quickly to Northern Ireland, because there's more details of the unlocking underway there.
Yeah, so you can get your hair cut. Amazing. But also, and this is really intriguing and a big sign of where things might go here, which we've talked about a lot on this programme. So our viewers, listeners will know the 2 metre rule is a big political point of vexation at the moment, because if you relax the distance that people have to be apart from each other, well, then it makes it much easier to open businesses, much easier to get kids back to school, etc., etc., etc. Northern Ireland has today said that kids going back to school can be within 1 metre of each other. And that is potentially transformational, not just there, but maybe these different bits of the country are all seeing the same science, they're all seeing the same advice, they're making their own decisions. Devolution has been a core point of all of this. But isn't it interesting? And is a big hint that, we might get the relaxation in the rest of the UK sooner than we think.
Sounds like the government is preparing to spend a lot of money in another policy area, and it's schools, and it's this thing that's been trailed already by the Prime Minister in various press conferences, a catch-up service, whatever that is, for pupils who've missed out on a lot of teaching during the pandemic.
Exactly. It's not iPlayer, if you're thinking of what's a catch-up service. So we know how big a problem it's been for the government and for schools, and most of all for families who've had kids at home, trying to teach them at home. The take-up of pupils going into schools has been pretty low. It's been very difficult for schools to get back up and running. So huge amounts of chat about, in the summer, kids getting some kind of extra help in order to try to close the gaps that we know have been widening all the time already. And tomorrow we're expecting an announcement, I think, probably of a pretty big chunk of change. If you think how much the government's spending everywhere on this crisis, and what we anticipate is there'll be loads more money for tutoring for kids who've been particularly at a disadvantage. But it's not clear yet what kind of thing will this be. Will it be summer camp, summer school, or will it be up to each individual school maybe to decide what to do with their bit of cash?
Well, let's discuss this now with a genuine expert. It's Carol Vorderman. Hello, Carol.
Hello. Thank you.
Now, Carol, you've got three hats in this conversation. One, maths superbrain. Two, founder of the Maths Factor, which is an online maths tutoring service, so very relevant to this discussion. And also, a few years ago, you helped out David Cameron when he was Prime Minister by doing a review about numeracy. So there's loads of things we can ask you.
Go ahead.
I suppose, first of all, have you been in touch, or had the government in touch with you about helping out with this massive tutoring effort? Could they be using your website?
No, they haven't, which is interesting, really, because so the Maths Factor we made freely available from as soon as lockdown started. And over that time, we now have just over 500,000 children who we're teaching. That's primary age children. And they are doing fantastically well, as they always do with us. Normally, we're in kind of an after-school online service where I teach them, and then Auntie Carol's there, teaching away. I'm seriously concerned about this, as I'm sure all parents are, and people in education, because I really do see the children who are in private education being given daily, massive daily learning and online tutoring and so on. And the disparity between what the state school and the private school system are providing is enormous. Now, that's not having a go at the state system, but the government has to step up here, because even in normal world, there is a thing called the summer dip. And it's known. It's one of those things that's known. Now, the key one for me, and I really feel for these kids, as the primary to secondary transition. It makes me quite angry, actually, this one, because it's known as the transition dip. And in both English and maths, so 42%, the latest stats said 42% of children in normal world who go up from year 6 to year 7 don't improve at all in English, or they regress. So that's almost half of them don't improve in year 7 at all in English, and it's about 37% in maths. And that, it's like, this isn't right.
So, Carol, do you expect that when this system is announced, that, because we hear rumours that it will be money for local authorities and schools for them to spend on tutoring in a way that they see fit, do you expect, or would you like it, that schools get vouchers that they could potentially spend on your website?
Well, I'm not here to talk about my website. I mean, we gave schools, we have hundreds of schools who use our system, as well as the 500,000 children via parents. We have hundreds of schools who've been given the free schools version. So I'm not here to sell that. I'm just here to say that I hope, because these children are wonderful, and when they come back and when they get it, I mean, obviously I'm talking about maths here, when they go, I get it. It's like they're given a superpower, and you see them walking taller and prouder. And also, the problems for parents with maths is that often the education system has changed the methods used again. And so you would get all over the country, Mum, you don't do it like that school. Am I right?
It's not even called long division anymore. I mean, for goodness sake.
Is it not? What's it called?
Parents who's probably not happy with the maths anyway. It's like, oh, no, I don't want to do it wrong. I don't want to do it wrong. So, there has to be a way forward.
So, Carol, I'm just trying to get to the bottom of where the blame lies. And I know that sounds like quite a negative way of framing the question, but I suppose that has to be identified if the system's going to improve. Is it the Department for Education, the Education Secretary? Is it local authorities? Is it academy trusts? Is it individual schools, their leadership, individual teachers? What's causing this problem?
I think education is in a transitional stage itself, where we have to accept, and of course children, of all ages now, but all the children in school are so used to touching the screen and something happens. It's how they live their life outside of school. And many schools have embraced technology, obviously. But I think we're now on to the next stage of it. It's a new chapter. And I'm not one to, that's your job to apportion blame, not mine. I'm an online educator and have been for many, many, many years. So we have a lot of data and factual evidence about what can be done.
Thank you very much, Auntie Carol. As they call you on your website. Carol Vorderman is not my aunt, just to be clear to the nation there. We're not related. Apparently, have you got some sums for us?
Well, I thought this was something that came up on Twitter today, so I thought it was apt. And it's a simple one. Well, I hope it's a simple one.
Oh, no.
I don't have a pen, so I'm going to have to type it on my phone, which makes it look like I'm using the calculator.
I've got a pen.
I'm feeling distinctly nervous.
So if we have a fraction, which is 3/4, or 3/4, as we would know it, what would that be as a percentage? Because a percentage is only a special kind of fraction, where the denominator is 100. If under the line is 100. So what is it as a percentage?
I'm quite relieved, because I'm pretty sure that's 75%.
Yay! Well,
yeah.
Goodness.
I can't resist showing my workings in kind of countdown style.
Carol, we've got to leave it there, but thank you very much.
My pleasure.
Thank you for sharing your passion for maths with us.
Well done, everybody, on your fraction.
Thank you very much, Carol. Now, today, somebody slipped into the UK from France without having to do the 14-day quarantine. But it wasn't against the rules, because there's an exemption for heads of state. It was President Emmanuel Macron of France who was here to see Boris Johnson, and they were commemorating the 80th anniversary of Charles de Gaulle's famous broadcast to the French people from exile in London. And the Brits pulled out all the stops, which means we're going to pull out all the journalistic stops and speak to our new France correspondent. It's Andrew Neil, who lives there. Andrew, hello.
Bonsoir.
Yes, and you're in your French home at the moment. And before we talk about Franco-British relations, the news has been dominated today about Dame Vera Lynn's death. Now, how can I put it? I don't feel qualified to talk about her place in British national story. Where would you place her?
Well, this probably surprises you, Adam, but I'm a bit too young to do that as well.
I know.
I was wondering when you were asking that question, Adam.
I know. I don't think I won't forget how he phrased that. For my parents' generation, which was the generation of the Second World War, my mother worked in the cotton mills in Paisley during the Second World War, making uniforms, and my father was out with Montgomery's Desert Rats, the 8th Army in North Africa. Vera Lynn was the voice of Britain for my parents' generation. There's often a tear in my mother's eye when the song was played on the radio or television.
Just to be clear, Andrew, I wasn't suggesting you were sat there as a lad at the gramophone when she was doing her
But I thought I'd
hits.
just let you know that I haven't entirely lost the ability to reply, despite all this period in lockdown.
Well, it's very, very nice for you to pass on your mum's recollections of that time rather than your very own.
So, to President Macron's visit today, I mean, Boris Johnson did pull out all the pomp and ceremony stops. Andrew, why do you think they felt the need to make such a big deal out of this?
Well, I think the first thing to say is that, above all, for Mr. Macron and for France, today is about General de Gaulle. It's the 80th anniversary of his famous broadcast from the BBC in London to the people of France. This year is also the 50th anniversary of his death. And every French politician, or senior politician on the centre and the centre-right at least, even sometimes on the left, wants the mantle of de Gaulle. And there was a ceremony here in France around a monument to all the people that were slaughtered by the Nazis in the French resistance before he went. And that, of course, de Gaulle was the voice of the French resistance. So for Mr. Macron, it's very much about their great national hero and about his attempt to say, I'm in his footsteps too. That said, I don't think there's any doubt that two things. One, President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson get on. In fact, they get on well. They like each other's company. And secondly, the Anglo-French relationship, in my view, has rarely been stronger, despite Brexit. Despite the difficulties that Brexit is causing between London and Paris, relations between the two countries in a bilateral way are very strong. And I think Boris Johnson's aim today was to emphasize that, to build on it, and to let Mr. Macron, the French, and the rest of Europe know that even though we're leaving, he still intends to have close relations with Europe, particularly with France.
Andrew, we know that President Macron didn't have to spend a fortnight in a doss house near Heathrow because of the quarantine rules. Being a president got him around that. But I wonder how has lockdown been where you are, in contrast with what you've seen on the news and what's been going on here?
But I think the thing about lockdown here in France is it's always been clear what was required of you. There's a very kind of Napoleonic rules put in place. You had to fill out a form as you were leaving the house. If you were stopped by the police and you had broken the conditions in that form, you could be fined. And if you did it several times, you could be fined a lot. So although you may have agreed or disagreed with the rules of the lockdown, there was no doubt, even as the lockdown loosened up and was more open to interpretation, there was no doubt as what was required of you. And the result of that, almost everybody in France followed it. And secondly, the lockdown itself is now pretty much over. I mean, France is way ahead of Britain now. The cafes, the restaurants, the bars, they're open. People can travel as much as they want. They can travel anywhere in Europe now as well. And it almost seems that we are through the worst here in France. And I think there's been a clarity about the rules, about what's required in France, that, to my mind, has not always been clear in Britain at all.
It's certainly not always been the sense here, and we know that lots of our viewers and listeners have been really quite confused by some of the government messaging on the way along. But it's interesting, Andrew, isn't it? Despite the clarity that you say, Macron has not been free of criticism at all. And actually, we've got a clip here. He actually apologised to the nation, didn't he, for things that have gone wrong. Let's listen to that and then pick that up with you in a sec.
Alors, étions-nous préparés à cette crise?
So were we prepared as a nation to confront this crisis?
Le moment.
All evidence points to the fact that we were not prepared enough. We have been tested and, to be frank, in many cases found wanting. Like in every country across the world, there has been a shortage of medical clothing and equipment such as masks, gloves and hand sanitizer. Unfortunately, we have not been able to supply as many masks as we would have liked to healthcare workers, those taking care of the elderly, nurses and home help.
And isn't it the case also, Andrew, that at one point the French actually burned some of the stockpile of medical equipment? I mean, how damaged...
They burned a stockpile because they didn't think it was required or it was out of date. Now, Mr. Macron went into this crisis pretty unpopular. You know all about the Gilets jaunes manifestations on the streets. Through the crisis, he's been pretty unpopular too, and coming out of it, he's pretty unpopular. And that's despite the fact that, now look, the French have had their problems. They've had a huge care home problem, just like Britain. There's one care home which is only about 5 kilometres from where I am. They'd had over 25 deaths in the space of a week. It's a national scandal there. They've had problems with equipment, and the French health service, which is by and large better equipped and better resourced than the British health service, has nevertheless been creaking at the edges. However, that being said, on the metrics by which you can judge these things, excess deaths, the total number of people to catch the virus, the number to die of the virus, France has done conspicuously better than the United Kingdom.
Andrew, I'm also just really tempted to ask you, you said most people in France, pretty much everybody has obeyed all of the rules. Have you? Have you filled in a form every time you've popped out to get a bottle of wine or a baguette?
Susan and I have gone walking for the dogs. We may have gone further than a kilometre from the house, because as you know, how much of a keep fit fanatic I am. But actually, it turned out it was a kilometre as the crow flies. So I think we pretty much stuck by it. You had to put the time down that you left the house. You couldn't be out for more than an hour. During the whole period we did that, we never actually saw any police, because it's quite remote here, and I think they were more concerned about numbers in the bigger cities and the urban areas. Can I just say, it's a sign of, we're all waiting to see if this air bridge is now going to be created between France and Britain. In France, although there was talk of retaliatory measures because of Britain's quarantine, they're there in theory, but they're not there in practice. People are now coming in from London to Nice airport and other airports. No one is questioning them. They're just being taken through. It's not an issue. And the reason why earlier we thought there was going to be an air bridge is a sign of the relationship between President Macron and Prime Minister Johnson. They texted each other about a month ago saying that there would be an air bridge which would make France an exemption for people coming from France into Britain. The problem is they didn't take their government machines along with it. These two agreed, but the machines hadn't put anything in place. I think you now see before the end of July that the opening up of the ability to travel from France to Britain and Britain to France will be pretty much in place.
Well, that's good, because I am going to be actually in your neck of the woods, Andrew, around about the 26th of August. But after my Vera Lynn comment, I don't think you'll be inviting me in now.
Sorry. That's why we've already taken steps to reconstitute the wine cellar and stock up with your favourite Blue Nun special cooler.
Andrew, lovely to hear from you. And hopefully we'll see you back in the building at some point in the next few weeks.
I hope so too. Great to hear all your voices.
Lovely to take care. Take care.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Andrew. Now, that's an honorary Frenchman. We're now going to bring in a real Frenchman, a legend, to recreate in his living room Charles de Gaulle's famous wartime address to the French people, delivered 80 years ago today. Today it's being delivered by David Ginola.
I call upon French engineers and skilled armaments workers who are on British soil or have the means of getting here to come and join me. I call upon the leaders, together with all soldiers, sailors and airmen of the French land, sea and air forces, wherever they may now be, to get in touch with me. I call upon all Frenchmen who want to remain free to listen to my voice and follow me. Long live Free France in honor and independence.
If you've just woken up, it's not a parallel universe where David Ginola is leading a French government in exile. Don't sign up, even though he just asked you to.
General Ginola.
Stirring stuff. Fantastique.
Didn't have the hat, though, did he?
You don't need to have the hat if you're David Ginola.
No. Exactly. Next up, Élysée Palace. For
Magnifique.
Ginola.
Magnifique.
Thank you all. Thank you for listening. And thank you for listening for the last 3 years as well. Bye.
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 The Coronavirus Newscast from the BBC.